I guess I'll start out by saying that I'm here tonight because I think that the United States joining the Belt and Road is a matter of burning urgency. And there are many different perspectives here in this room, many different views, but I'm willing to work with anyone who understands the importance of bringing about a shift in our overall economic policy and our relationship with the world. I just got back from a very important gathering in Moscow, the International Forum for the Development of Parliamentism. I was able to meet with elected officials from all across the planet, and I was able to hear about the achievements of the Eurasian Economic Union, as well as the BRICS Forum. And I've included some of what I learned in my travels, in my remarks, which I'll get to later on. Now, I wanted to begin by saying that I consider myself to be both a leftist and a revolutionary. However, I apply those words a little bit differently than people commonly think of them. When you think of leftists and revolutionaries, you probably think of like Les Miserables and the guys on the barricades shooting their guns, or anarchists throwing bombs, or some craziness. That's not actually what these words mean. The word revolution comes from the Latin word revolutio, which means to turn around, and it did not actually have any political implication until the year of 1543, when a brave scientist, an astronomer named Copernicus, wrote a groundbreaking book called On the Revolutions of Heavenly Spheres. Copernicus had discovered, using his telescope and mathematical calculations, that the Earth was not actually the center of the universe, and that the Earth was actually revolving around the sun. Now, the Catholic Church and the feudal order of kings and aristocrats denounced his discovery and insisted that the Earth was, in fact, the center of the universe. And it was those brave individuals who stood for scientific truth and thought that reason and rational thinking should be the guide for civilization who started to call themselves revolutionaries and challenge the existing social order. Well, like the revolutionaries of the 1500s and the 1600s, I believe in science and human reason. I do not believe that vulgar authoritarianism and emotionalism should be permitted to hold back human progress. So in the year of 2018, I consider myself to be a revolutionary. And furthermore, I consider myself to be a leftist. Now, where do these connotations of left and right come from? Well, the connotations of the political left and the political right can be traced back to May 5th of 1789. And that's the date in which, during the French Revolution, the Third Estate, or the commoners, broke away and formed their own National Assembly, the National Assembly. And someone who was there at the time, Baron de Gonville, he described what was taking place in the room when the National Assembly was formed. He said, "We began to recognize each other. Those who were loyal to religion and the king took up positions on the right side of the chair so as to avoid the shouts, oaths, and indecencies that were enjoying free reign in the opposing camp. Those who were loyal to the old order and wanted to preserve the old, outmoded ways of feudalism sat on the right wing." And 2 years later, those on the left side of the National Assembly actually started referring to themselves as the innovators. And these were people who, unlike the right wing, they wanted to march boldly in the modern world, and they sat on the left. I'm in favor of innovation, human creativity, reason, science, and rational thinking. I believe in historical progress and the struggle of humanity to advance. So in that sense, in the sense that both of those terms were originally defined, I am a leftist and I am a revolutionary. And when I look at my country, the United States of America, I'm deeply worried by what I see. Our country is often described as the richest country in the world. And it's true that we do have the richest rich people in the entire world. But increasingly, the way that these richest rich people in the entire world become rich is by making the country and the rest of the world poor. The standard of living facing the next generations of Americans is vastly lower than what their parents had. Young Americans, despite having college degrees, they still have huge amounts of student debts. They face a lifetime of low-wage service sector jobs. All across the country, water is not being properly purified. Power plants are crumbling. Highways are falling apart. What's left of our rail system, Amtrak, is in a state of chronic disrepair. Hospitals are closing down. In 27 different states right now, they're actually unpaving the roads. They have a device called a reclaimer where they take asphalt roads, they pull up the asphalt, and they pulverize it. 27 different states, they're taking paved roads, asphalt roads, and transforming them into dirt roads. That's taking place across the United States. This is not a good situation, and during the last election, millions of Americans rallied around both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump because they saw these figures as a force of opposition to the bankrupt political establishment. The ruling elite of the United States billionaire monopolists, entrenched circles of power and wealth are taking the country on a course toward disaster, and millions of Americans do not approve of this dangerous trajectory and are desperately looking for a way out. Well, I'm telling you as someone who has been around the world, I've been to Russia, I've been to Iran, been to Venezuela, Ecuador, and Brazil, there is a way out of this madness and insecurity. This way out has different names. You could call it socialism, you could call it central planning, you could call it rational thinking, you could call it 21st century statecraft, or you could simply call it common sense. But capitalism is the rule of profits, and society being organized in order to make money for a small group of owners. And the alternative is a society in which science and human reason take control of the major centers of economic power, the banks, the factories, the oil wells, the transportation systems, and organize them for the purpose of moving society forward. Capitalism, just like feudalism before it, and slavery before that, and primitive hunter-gatherer tribal civilization, has outlived its usefulness. The billionaires and the bankers in Wall Street and London, who currently rule the world, are doing everything they can to hold back human progress in the hopes of holding on to their own power. And this is particularly apparent when you look at a particular brand of insanity that has taken hold in the Western world, particularly in the 1970s and 80s. The economic theories commonly called neoliberalism. That's Ludwig von Hayek, Milton Friedman, Ayn Rand, Ludwig von Mises. Their belief system essentially boils down to the idea that you can cut your way into economic growth. If you cut, you can create economic growth. Well, I'm not a Harvard-educated economist. I don't have a bunch of letters after my name. But if there's one thing I am absolutely sure of, it's that you cannot cut your way to economic growth. They've essentially sold us a fairy tale that goes like this, that if you lay off government workers, you cut social spending and eliminate welfare programs, you stop funding scientific research, if you defund and privatize the educational system, well, then everyone's taxes will go down, and people will spend more money, and the economy will grow. Well, this is complete and utter nonsense, and you're actually more likely to see the economy grow by asking Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy to help you along. I think that might be more likely. When you eliminate the jobs of government workers, then their ability to spend goes away. When you lay off teachers and strip away the salaries of firefighters and public employees, and stop providing food assistance to low-income families, enabling them to purchase agricultural goods, the result is spending less money. Less goods are sold. Meanwhile, the richest of the rich, the billionaire elite, whose investments are essential in a capitalist economy, these folks don't invest money because they feel like investing money. They invest money because they want to see a return on their investment. And as the public loses its ability to spend, the rich stop investing because they're not going to see a return on their investment in an atmosphere of reduced spending power on the overwhelming majority of the public. The libertarian Chicago school policies have resulted in a vast drop in the standard of living for the majority of the population, alongside a freeze in the investment coming from the rich. It's essentially economic suicide. During the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Jeffrey Sachs and other neoliberal economists associated with the International Monetary Fund were dispatched to help Boris Yeltsin transition Russia away from the Soviet Union. They oversaw the selling off of state industries and the cutting of social programs. The result was 20 to 30% unemployment, malnutrition, and an increase on a large scale of heroin addiction and suicide. American and British corporations were purchasing factories all over the former Soviet Union. After they bought them, they closed their doors. 700,000 factories were closed down during this period. There was 80% of Russian farms also closed down. Statistics show that Russia's population decreased by roughly 10% between 1992 and 2006. Roughly 6.6 million people, that's 1 out of every 10 people living in Russia at that time, either died or fled the country. The reason that Vladimir Putin is so popular in Russia is because his presidency has marked a sharp departure with the disaster created by neoliberalism and free market economics. Putin, a former KGB officer who was a university student, he wrote a thesis about the concept of what he called national champions. These are like super corporations that are used to strengthen an economy. And he drew from Karl Marx, he drew from Adam Smith, he drew from many different economists, and developed a theory about how Russia could use its natural resources, its oil and its natural gas, to reboot the economy and recover from the disaster resulting from the fall of the Soviet Union. After being elected, Putin created Gazprom and Rosneft, a state-controlled oil company and a state-controlled natural gas company. Creating them was a long process that involved the seizing of the property of many capitalists, many of these oligarchs that had gotten rich while the country was falling to shreds. He seized their property. In fact, Bill Browder, a hedge fund manager associated with BP, fled the country. He's now the brilliant anti-Russian expert on CNN. And a number of these oligarchs who had wrecked the country have actually gone to prison. Now, the dramatic economic reforms that came about during the first 8 years of Putin's administration had very good results. The wages of the average Russian worker tripled. The GDP started rising again. The industrial output finally reached the levels it was during the Soviet era, and poverty was reduced by 14%. Reorganizing Russia's economy around the state. By doing that, Putin was able to vastly change the economic situation. And if you look at China's history, it's a similar story. During the 1800s, China was kept in a state of chronic poverty by the domination of American and British banking institutions. You'll recall that China waged 2 opium wars, basically, where they were forced by the British to not erect tariffs and to allow British corporations to dominate their economy and continue to shipping narcotics in as a way to keep the population controlled and subdued. Well, in 1911, you had Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the father of Chinese nationalism, who carried out a great revolution. Dr. Sun Yat-sen created the Republic of China based on his 3 principles: independence, democracy, and the people's livelihood. Sun Yat-sen was not a Marxist, but he did believe in socialism, and he was a friend of Vladimir Lenin. He worked with the newly formed Soviet Union, and he was actually an observer, but not a member of the Communist International. He allowed the Chinese Communist Party to participate in the Nationalist Party as a faction. However, Sun Yat-sen died, and then in 1927, Chiang Kai-shek seized power. Chiang Kai-shek was tied in with Wall Street in London. He began slaughtering communists, privatizing the economy, and moving away from Dr. Sun Yat-sen's vision of building a prosperous society. So the Chinese Communist Party, which based itself on the ideology of Marxism-Leninism and Mao Zedong thought, they became the inheritors of Dr. Sun Yat-sen's vision for building a prosperous new China. The communists played a pivotal role in defeating the Japanese invaders, and in 1949 they established the People's Republic. In 1949, when that happened, China did not have a single steel mill. Today, China produces half of the steel in the entire world. At that point, the overwhelming majority of China's population was illiterate. Today, illiteracy has been wiped out in China. China had a very limited railway system at the time of the revolution in 1949. Today, China is producing some of the fastest trains in the entire world, going over 350 miles an hour. China is leading the world in terms of scientific research and development. 700 million people have been lifted out of poverty, and 30 million people remain in poverty, but the Chinese Communist Party's goal is that by 2020 to completely eliminate all poverty in China. China is now the 2nd largest economy in the world. Every day, another Chinese person becomes a billionaire. And there are all kinds of private corporations and businesses. But at the end of the day, the state and the Chinese Communist Party have absolute power. The Chinese Communist Party creates 5-year economic plans and directs state-run industries. The Chinese stock market brings in foreign investment, but it's tightly controlled, with the Communist Party overseeing and telling stockholders what they can and cannot sell or do. The Chinese call their system socialism with Chinese characteristics. China is not a capitalist country. It's a planned economy in which all kinds of market mechanisms are permitted, but human reason and logic, not profits and the irrationality of greed, determine what goes on and how production is carried out. And this is actually the 40-year anniversary of what they call the reform and opening up. And that was 40 years ago in China that you had the Gang of Four, which was this ultra-leftist faction that was engaging in persecuting people and keeping China in a state of chronic poverty. And Deng Xiaoping rose to power, and he defeated the Gang of Four. And in response to their argument that it was okay to keep China in a state of poverty as long as it was pure and true to socialist principles, Deng Xiaoping famously said, "Poverty is not socialism, but to be rich is glorious." And I actually wrote a book myself, Getting Rich Without Capitalism, because I feel like there's a lot of confusion. In the USA, people think that socialism or communism is about making everything equal or redistributing the wealth. The reality is, socialism is a change in property relations. Socialism is society taking control of the economy and forcing it to work rationally in the interest of public good. It was socialism in the Soviet Union that created the world's first space program and transformed Russia from being an impoverished agrarian country into a world industrial superpower. Socialism in Cuba has created a public healthcare system that's marveled at all over the world. But socialism in China is doing something far more important. Socialism in China is laying the basis for an alternative form of globalization. The One Belt, One Road initiative involves China going to developing countries, building hydroelectrical power plants, water systems, universities, healthcare clinics, and other essential infrastructure. All over the world, Wall Street and London have kept countries in a state of chronic poverty in order to maintain a monopoly. However, China has invested in the developing world, building up infrastructure on the basis of win-win cooperation. Now, whenever I give a talk like this, I'll get people on the internet or people I'll meet and they'll say, Caleb, do you really think the Chinese are they're just purely selfless, right? They're just going around the world being kind to people, they have no self-interest. No, I don't think that. I think that they are trying to get wealthier, but they're getting wealthier by making other people wealthier. That's the concept of win-win cooperation, is we invest in your country, you get richer, then there's more of you to trade with, so then we get richer, and you get richer, and we get richer, and we both do better. It's the exact opposite of how Wall Street and London have set up the global economy, where they work hard to keep the rest of the world poor so that they can stay rich. If the USA could join the Belt and Road and become part of this alternative economic model, life could vastly improve for so many Americans who are suffering right now. We could rebuild our university system so that once again we're churning out the best engineers and scientists. We could defeat the heroin gangs and the drug dealers and build a real economy with good paying jobs for the next generation. We could build a high-speed railway system connecting the Midwest and the South to the prosperous coastal areas. The economic model of Wall Street involves getting rich by tearing things down. They make money foreclosing homes and destroying neighborhoods. They make money from locking people in prison with a prison industrial complex. They make money from wars and death and destruction around the world. But the Belt and Road is about orienting our economy to once again function toward growth and construction, raising people out of poverty, creating new scientific discoveries, and advancing all of civilization in the process. We face two dangerous elements right now in U.S. politics. On the one hand, we have hateful anti-immigrant bigots, forces spewing racial division and police state repression. On the other hand, we have a so-called left that favors destruction and tearing people down, is not really putting forward a rational vision for socialist economic planning. But the Belt and Road represents what is truly hopeful in the world, what is truly left-wing, and what is truly revolutionary. It represents historical progress. It's a beacon of hope in an era filled with so much despair and pessimism. I'm absolutely committed to winning my fellow Americans to the idea of joining the Belt and Road and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I think it's absolutely essential that we find a way to get the United States involved in this great project of transforming the world economy and transforming ourselves in the process. And I hope that we can come to an understanding here today and move further ahead in the goal of getting the United States to join the Belt and Road. Thank you. Yeah. Well, you know, that's very interesting because the reason that I began my presentation by saying I consider myself a leftist and a revolutionary, but then I went on to define what both of those things mean, is because in a lot of ways, to a lot of people who call themselves left, that's not what they mean. And I also, the reason I emphasized in my talk the anniversary of the reform and opening up is because the Gang of Four, that mentality that the Gang of Four had in China that, hey, it doesn't matter if we stay poor, just so long as we're pure and revolutionary, that's very much the mindset you find in the left. Even though leftism itself is defined by historical progress, there are a lot of forces that really just believe in, I don't know what they believe in. I really don't, you know, and it's very interesting that a lot of things that were associated with fascism and the far right prior to the Second World War are now associated with the left. For example, you know, the left doesn't talk about the Belt and Road, but what's one thing they talk a lot about? Tibetan separatism, right? The Dalai Lama is just loved in left-wing circles. Oh, he's this great hero. Well, the Dalai Lama's brother was airdropped into Tibet by the CIA. They killed tens of thousands of people. I mean, this man is a mass murderer. And prior to the Chinese Revolution, Tibet was not a paradise. That was feudalism. I mean, people were slaves. And if you so much as spoke against the Dalai Lama, you had your eyes poked out. And you know who really admired the Dalai Lama? Adolf Hitler, you know, and Benito Mussolini. And so why is it that the left is in love with the Dalai Lama, and hates the Chinese government, it's building hospitals and schools. You know what I'm saying? There's a weird, and this, in leftist circles, there's a real obsession with the occult and with, mysticism and a lot of stuff like that. And that also was always associated with the far right. If you look at, Aleister Crowley and why is it the Nazis adopted the swastika as their symbol? They were in awe of the caste system in ancient India, and they thought that was the cure for class struggle. So all of these really backward-looking and destructive beliefs that are not scientific have been embraced on the left. Meanwhile, the left is attacking forces that advocate social progress. So I'm a leftist, but I figure I'm a leftist in the same vein that President Xi is a leftist. I believe in historical progress, but I really do believe that there is an entity walking around calling itself left in the United States that is in essence very, very, very right-wing. And I'm not saying that I don't believe in global warming, but I'm critical of the environmental movement too, because what you showed in your presentation, Barack Obama saying that people in Africa should stay poor, that's not progressive thinking. That's just not progressive thinking. But the more you hang out in environmental circles, though, the more you hear this kind of thing, that humans are the problem. Humans are a cancer, right? There's just too many people in the world. It's Malthusianism. The feudal aristocracy made the exact same arguments when their system was facing being overthrown. They said, oh, it can't be that our system's not working any longer. Oh, the problem is just there's too many people. All these peasants need to stop breeding, then there'll be enough food again, everything will work fine. That's an old order dying is what they always declare. So yeah, I think that there is an entity walking around calling itself left that is very different than the left. And if you look at the history, I became a leftist and a Marxist not by reading things from the 1960s. I read William Z. Foster, who was the leader of the Communist Party of the United States in the 1930s. He wrote a beautiful book, Towards Soviet America. And what does he talk about? He talks about building high-speed, no high-speed trains, but building new power plants and a rationally planned economy in the United States. And there's a politician in the USA who was the governor of Louisiana during the 1930s. His name was Huey Long. And he's portrayed as a dictator, and he's just hated. But in Louisiana, where he was the governor, he's loved. And in fact, all over Louisiana, they've got bridges named after him. They've got schools named after him. He's a hero in Louisiana. And if you listen to him, he didn't call himself a socialist or a communist. He said he believed in sharing the wealth. But if you listen to the speeches that he used, he called himself a populist. Huey Newton of the Black Panther Party is actually named after him because the black community benefited so much from Huey Long's policies. And what did he do? He was taxing the oil companies, the Rockefellers, and building infrastructure all over Louisiana. And like Deng Xiaoping said, poverty is not socialism, to get rich is glorious. Huey Long, he said, it's not about making people poor. He said, every man a king, but none shall wear a crown. And I think that's populism. That's the basis of leftism, right? That people should be given priority. You go back to the time of, what was the difference between the Dark Ages and the Renaissance? In the Dark Ages, there was this notion that the peasants and the people existed to serve those above them. But that changed in the Renaissance period. And there was this notion that the leadership had an obligation to serve the people, right? And that's what changed. And that's what brought us, some of the brilliant art and science and all these breakthroughs, was suddenly the leadership had an obligation to serve the population. And that was really, the birth of the Renaissance in Europe. So populism, in my view, is not a bad thing. And I see a lot of anti-populism that passes for leftism, and that bothers me. I hope I didn't go too long. It's kind of along the lines of what was said before in some of our criticism of left-wing circles. You see a lot of, I don't know what you call it, but I guess anti-Americanism in left-wing circles, people burning the American flag. I remember I was briefly around a certain left-wing group that used to chant, "We are not Americans, we are proletarians." And it's a little bit weird because, if someone was running for the presidency of Sweden, they wouldn't run on a platform of "I hate Sweden." If someone was running for the presidency of Yemen, they wouldn't run on a platform of "I hate Yemen." And when Mao was up in the mountains, he said he wasn't saying "I'm fighting to destroy China." He was saying "I'm fighting to build a new China." And there's so much pessimism. And that if you look at the Communist Party of the United States, when they were a massive organization, especially in this city in the 1930s, what was their slogan? They said communism is nothing but 20th century Americanism. In fact, their leader, Earl Browder, used to say, if Washington, Lincoln, and Roosevelt were alive today, why, they would be members of the Communist Party. And there was this understanding that that if you want to play a role in American politics, You need to insert yourself into American history. And that in China they call their system socialism with Chinese characteristics. And I've been very outspoken about the fact that we need to be starting to talk about socialism with American characteristics. Because that Chinese system's never going to come over here. The Russian system's never going to come over here. The Cuban system's never going to come over here. But the kind of predatory capitalism that we have over here cannot continue if humanity is going to continue. And we need to look into, not just into Che Guevara and Lenin and all these exciting figures around the world, we also ought to talk about, about revolutionary figures from our own history and figure out how those of us who want to change the United States can fit into U.S. society. If you want to have a countercultural protest against U.S. society, you'll probably feel really good at the end of the day. But if you actually want to change the United States, you need to be part of the United States. And you need to figure out how you can reject racism and slavery and the slaughter of the native people and all the awful things that have gone on, but find a progressive part of American history and claim it as your own and carry on that legacy. And that's because I talk that way in left-wing circles, people accuse me of being a Nazi, by the way. just so you know. So, that's how insane the left has gotten. But if you're serious about changing the United States of America, you have to find a way to fit yourself into the United States of America.
Yeah, here, what you said. Yeah, well done. Okay.